Greetings. Welcome to all of you tuning in here live to this very first event as part of the approach to the grand opening of the School of Mythopoetics. I am Ian MacKenzie, and I'm joined here by my collaborator, co-founder, two-thirds of the co-founding team. Daniel is with us in the chat, but John Wolfstone, welcome to our conversation.
Thank you, Ian.
I am delighted here to kick this off, in a good way. And John and I were just sort of emergently remixing exactly where we're going to go, and I don't think we know exactly where we're going to go, which is part of the beauty of emergence. And the topic, of course, is on reclaiming initiation, rites of passage in the modern era. And there's a lot that we could cover in this 90 minutes or so. And first, I want to say again, welcome to all of you who are tuning in live. How it'll work is that you can leave your comments, actually, if you're tuning in on Facebook or YouTube. Leave your comments, and we'll see them on where we are. And we'll find ways either to bring in a sort of emergent way throughout the conversation, or we'll open up a bit more of a Q&A part where we can sort of more directly answer your questions. But feel free to leave a sort of running commentary as well for what what stirs you, what stands out, what you're impacted by, because that also helps us understand what is landing in that way. Also, I wanted to name again that this is part of the first of 5 events that are being offered up in this lead up to the grand opening of the school on June 1st, 2022. Up next week is one of Europe's best and most incredible storytellers, one of my favorites, Jan Blake, who's joining us. That's next Wednesday, as well as a number of other events that are coming. So yeah, I'm excited and delighted, and to kick it off here with this first one is a treat. Last thing to mention before we sort of step into a more intentional opening is that while we're in this sort of pre-opening phase, there is special membership rates that we're inviting for you to become a founding member of the school, which offers a sort of definitely discounted a rate to join and to be part of this initial wave, this initial surge into the school. So if you're interested in that, check out schoolofmythopoetics.com. We'll paste a link, and you can check out all the details of what's going to go on in the school. This particular talk and all these others are meant to offer a taste of what we do in the school. And if you're stirred by that and you're drawn, then maybe the school is for you. Okay. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to John to help open us in a good way.
Thank you, Ian. I'm just feeling my body, feeling my heart, maybe inviting others, take a moment to feel your body and ground in, to this vessel that we have. And as you do that, I really want to acknowledge the land that I'm on. I want to acknowledge that I am a settler on the stolen and unceded traditional homelands of the Cowichan and Wasanich First Nations here up in what is now known as Salt Spring Island, British Columbia, BC. And so much of this work of reclamating rites of passage in a modern era is been supported and anchored through the wisdom of First Nations folks from around the world. And I think coming back into a certain repair and reparation of what it is to be on stolen land is at the center of what this work is. And with that, I'd also want to light this candle and just say a prayer, acknowledging my own ancestors, the Eastern European, Ashkenazi, Jewish, Germanic, Norse, Celtic, and all of the others that are here backing me up, supporting this work, and just sending a prayer for this greater rite of passage that I feel we are in as a species, that all the forces, of the earthly and celestial planes can come in support us to do this integration work that is necessary to hopefully create a much more beautiful world. And I also want to say, I want to encourage others that if you want to, I don't know if we can all see the comments, but if for yourself, you want to acknowledge the land that you are on, if that's a practice that you have or something that, has come into right relationship with you, I encourage you to leave it as a comment here. And yeah, with that, Ian, I'm not sure if you want to prompt me a way to begin, or I can dive in.
Yeah. Thanks for that, John. And just to say one, for the people that are listening, if they're all tuned in on YouTube, for example, they'll see each other's YouTube comments. And if they're all tuned in on Facebook, they'll see the Facebook comments. So feel free to take the invitation as John's offered there. And for myself as well, I do wish to acknowledge the Comox Nation, of which the territory that I'm on now, up here in the Comox Valley, and grateful to be able to have this conversation here, and to recognize that the ongoing wake of colonization is not in the past; it is ongoing now, and a lot of this, cultural work is part of it, certainly, to try to return to right relationship. And so may this conversation be a prayer, be somewhat in service to that as well. Okay, so in terms of jumping into this conversation, I feel we should perhaps begin at the beginning, which is at the title. We say reclaiming initiation. And so maybe to start with, what is initiation in the context that we're attempting to use it here? I think that would help support some of the framework of understanding, how we enter into this conversation with some degree of perhaps a shared understanding, right? First, because it could mean different things to different people.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Yeah, I mean, maybe to speak about adulthood initiation is to also speak about rites of passage, like what I mean by that term. And this is something that's been for me a point of study and experience for years. I know what I want to say, which was also spoken in the title to this talk, that rites of passage were at the center of every indigenous and ancestrally connected culture on planet Earth. And in many ways were one of the main cultural facets that kept that culture generative and intact and healthy and in service to life. And in the broadest sense, a rite of passage is a cultural response to the necessity to help human beings transition psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, and then also culturally from one life stage to another. So if you want to think about it, there's actually a really simple wheel of at one end, there's birth, which is its first rite of passage into this world. Down at the bottom, there is a rite of passage, which, most of us are vaguely, somewhat aware of, because something biologically happens pretty strong at this time, which is the adolescent rite of passage, where puberty sets in, and for women, moon time sets in. Going up here, there is the adulthood initiation rite of passage, which is between adolescence and adulthood. And this is the one that I'm going to speak about in more focus. And then there's one up top between adulthood and elderhood, coming back to the start of death, which is, of course, the great mystery rite of passage that we're all headed towards. So within that initiation, which is a big word, in the way that I understand it and speak to it, is really about this adulthood initiation rite of passage, which is so important because not just for most of us personally, but really what I see is us kind of right now in a globalized mass world. This is the rite of passage that we are, like, as a species, stuck at. And you could say for most of us, our development has been pretty much arrested in this, like, adolescent phase, which we're going to talk about. And I know from... Am Masi,
Yeah,
if you want to.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's helpful too, I think, to speak to, again, what do we mean by adolescence, right?
Hmm.
Because, I'll give an example that, I have a son now. He's 3.5, and, wild character, that so much of his world is clearly about himself, right? He is the
Yeah.
center of his universe, which is totally appropriate for a child, right? Because I can see as I observe him, how he relates to the world is also part of this deep learning, right? This play, this learning. What are my boundaries? Like, what can I explore? What can I feel ownership of or not? Or like all these different things, right? Is
Hmm.
totally appropriate for a child. But at a certain point, unless that orbit or that orientation towards the world isn't somehow
Hmm.
and intentionally um, met with some kind of, we'll talk about this in a little bit actually, of what the functionality is or what the kind of architecture is and why. But unless it's somehow confronted, then you get a sort of adolescent orientation to life that is, runs on until essentially death, right? That there's this sense that the world is there for you. And there's a term, right, which has come up now these days, which is the distinction between olders and elders, right? And
Hmm.
that we have essentially, there's a lot of olders who've actually never gone through these kinds of initiatory passages, which, we see the consequence of that, I think, en masse, both within, interpersonal relationships, but also within
Hmm.
leadership, for example, politicians and the rest, and the way that they essentially behave like children, in positions at which requires deep maturity, deep sense of responsibility and accountability. So I just wanted to speak a little bit to that there is a beauty, in a sense, and a necessity, right, to adolescence and that centralized orbit of oneself. But what we're talking about here is, why would a culture deliberately choose to end it? To end that period of life and into what?
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, Ian, is that it must be, uh, there must be a deliberate cultural um, response to actually end it, which is where a rite of passage is, I'd say, there is healing in it. And I think nowadays, in a modern era, which we're going to talk about, there needs to be quite a bit more healing than maybe traditionally there was, because we are coming in already so, you could say, um, developmentally incomplete, where most of us didn't get healthy childhoods, healthy rites of passage from childhood to adolescence. And there's actually a lot of wounding in this greater initiatory rite of passage that needs to be taken care of. And the other point, though, is that there must be an element of death, and there must be a container that creates a certain pressure cooker of challenge to actually create the like initiatory cauldron to where a certain psychological maturation can occur. And to break that down a bit more, in the adolescent stage is really about healthy ego development, which is really about trying on different roles. It's about seeing oneself in society and in different roles, and really figuring out a sense of self and boundaries. And it's really about a lot of self gratification, which is necessary at that like time. But in a healthy culture, there needs to be this initiatory rite of passage where the adolescent self can functionally die. And I think of this often like a caterpillar going into a chrysalis that pretty much functionally dies and dissolves, so that a higher dimensional being can emerge, which as a adult, in the way that we are speaking about it, it is where they no longer just see themselves as a separate self, but they see themselves as a interdependent self, where self is also other. And in that sense, they can step into a cosmology where they are truly in service into a life. And that is something that your ego can think about. You're a very healthy adolescent ego can think they are in service to life, and that they are serving others. But ultimately, what I see happening is a lot of people being in service in order to actually get their own needs met, in order to be like loved and received. And it still is this kind of like adolescent barter. And there actually needs to be a greater rite of passage process that actually can sever that part of us that is separate to come into a greater sense of that like interdependent whole. Maybe I can speak, Ian, just quickly about to put this in like a bit of a story context, like how this came to happen in my own life. So I think that would maybe ground it a bit.
Yeah.
I can say that I was, at the time that I found out about initiation and rites of passage, I think I was about 26 and I was living in San Francisco, California. And I essentially felt that as far as like a society, I had made it. I had a great job teaching filmmaking to at-risk youth. I was living in an art collective. I was doing tons of side projects. Like I had this quintessentially kind of perfect life. And yet I felt hollow inside. And I felt essentially somewhat dead inside because I actually knew there's this unconscious calculator in me that we all have that knew that the world is extremely broken. And there was no sense in me of what I was doing was actually addressing that in any kind of way. And that my life, it felt, was really not actually amounting to any greater cause. And that's actually, when we actually tune into that place, that is a very existentially lonely place. And this started to really burn in me, and the level of like contradiction of that feeling and staying on in that life became quite great. And at that time I heard and I read about, and kind of life led me to this idea of like, oh, at this time of life, you'd usually go through some kind of rite of passage where not only would you really face death, because that is what happens. It's really the point where a human being faces their own mortality and integrates that, which is part of what allows this greater sense of being able to be of service. And it's also through entering this liminal underworld, because going into that place of facing death necessarily puts one on a journey into a sort of underworld where one has to come to face with one's wounds and one's shadows, both personally and collectively. And the lack of us facing those shadows and wounds on a collective level is why we continue to have this very destructive mass cultural world that we have. And part of that, though, and this for me was what was really captivating, is that what I read and heard was that it's in that shadow liminal place, liminal being a place where boundaries seem to dissolve and one is betwixt and between. Perhaps you could say like what it is to be out walking in the dark, in the forest, in the middle of the night, is where reportedly a truer, deeper vision for one's life. Something that Bill Plotkin, the eco psychologist, has talked about as, the like greater niche you are meant to fill in the ecological web of like life is revealed. This like place that is commonly referred to as soul. And I was at that point, it was like, wow, if there is a vision, if there is some greater sense of what my life is meant for that can be uncovered, because I think seeking it is not actually the right term. There's not another moment to like live just carrying on as like is. So I left. I created a severance, which is one of the stages of a traditional rite of passage, and really embarked on a journey into the unknown with this clear intention that I want to become a initiated adult, which is actually highly weird that somebody would want that, but yet that is what was coming through. And what I thought would be like a year-long journey became nearly a decade of quite amazing coming into contact with both my wounds, personally and collectively, but also a contact with the mystery and a certain relationship with the uncertainty of like life, where continually again and again I got peeled and stripped layer after layer of having to form a relationship with, some people call a higher power. I call the great mystery, the spiritual ecology of like life, to where there's really a partnership where no longer I could find safety through attempting to egoically control and map out my life, which is really where we are at as a mass culture. But I had to actually surrender into a partnership. It's not just complete letting go, but a partnership with mystery that is, for me, what the hallmark of being a initiated adult is. It is that capacity to know that true power comes from something greater through oneself, and it's that relationship that for me is the nature of prayer and ceremony and ritual, which is so much of how my life is navigated now, and what's led me, and I think you also, to be here in the creation of the school.
Mm. Thanks, John. Yeah, I want to highlight a couple of pieces there. One is that there's a certain necessity of having an intentional confrontation, encounter, meeting with death, right? And that's something that's some of a classic element of initiation that I think is helpful, because I think we could unpack that a little more. Like, why is that so alchemical in some ways? And the second thing is that it can take time, and it does take time, like, as in that this idea can often be sort of in this personal growth, quick fix kind of culture, that it's like, head to the weekend workshop and then, like, boom, you're done, you're initiated, you come back.
Yes.
Which is again, can have its place, absolutely. And at the same time, the danger of that, right, is that you don't realize that it's very much it's more like an orientation that is constantly a discipline, I think, right?
Yes.
And marking a moment of almost like the ebb of a season shifting, right? It's rare that a season suddenly is like, boom, winter comes spring, right? That there's actually a transitionary phase. So you're nodding your head a lot, so I want to turn it back to you, and then I want to return a bit to the death confrontation. But go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I mean, I'm starting to, it takes a bit in these talks to really find the line. I'm feeling it now because, okay, to speaking to everybody out there, the chief problem we have is that in a traditional healthy culture, you wouldn't have to think about this. Elders and mentors would come and rip you from your bed in the middle of the night and thrust you and a bunch of your peers into a rite of passage that you would be in, and the culture would hold you in. That's not what we have now. And maybe the first step of this rite of passage is facing the grief that no one is coming for you. No elder, as far as I can tell, none of us are living in a intact enough culture, outside of maybe a few still First Nations groups on this planet, where people are going to come and just do that for you. So we're in this really tricky place where essentially we each need to take the responsibility for our own rites of passage. And the paradox of this, you cannot hold it yourself. You cannot initiate yourself. So it's like, whoa, what? That literally makes no logical sense.
And this is really interesting to name why, though. Why can't you do it yourself, right? Because my understanding, and by yourself meaning, it's almost like you cannot both hold the container as well as surrender to it at the same time. Because, and the reason that I've been, in the way I've been taught, is because your ego will circumvent its very
100%.
desire to want it to happen, right? Because then it just becomes a heroic, hey, look what I can do, right? As opposed to the thing that actually is meant to get underneath the ego and actually have it confront the very alchemical, wildness. So, okay, over to you again.
Totally. And we could do a whole nother talk, which we actually are. I want to say the third talk in the series is about the shift from the hero to the trickster. And just that heroic aspect is taking death and making it something more about fame, which is it is really trying to subvert what death actually is. So I want to say, yeah, your ego doesn't want to die. And it shouldn't. That's not just like what the ego is, its role. And the ego is actually fine. There's nothing wrong with the ego, but you can't, from a place of ego psychological maturity, create an ego death for yourself. It's literally impossible. Your ego will always circumvent it. But so there is something of this like courtship with the unknown and with this process. And I want to say there is no program, and I'm somebody that is currently stepping towards running adulthood initiation programs. And even then, it is beyond the scope of any programmatic thing because it is nonlinear and it always inherits a certain sense of a certain kind of relationship and bowing to the mystery of it. And in that sense, I want to say it's really about creating a cultural context around oneself. So you become like generating a cultural context around oneself. You could say like a ecological web, where I often use the like metaphor of like planting a cultural garden that eventually can hold you enough to where you can really let go. So it kind of builds step by step. And I also want to say, it's just something I say kind of to my clients a lot, and this is going to sound perhaps controversial, but yet I'm going to say it. Modern therapy doesn't work if it does nothing to change the cultural context you are in, because part of the brokenness that we are all dealing with and going to therapy for is due to having been born and raised and developed and hurt in a broken cultural context. And yeah, I'd say that therapy is a pretty key element for most people in their healing journey and in their greater initiatory process. It just cannot be the only thing. So in that, some like steps that I want to really claim are just like, so what does this mean? How do you approach this? One of the first things I do with people that I work with, and I tell to anybody, is you need to begin to court what I call anchors, but you could say are both a amalgamation of mentors and elders. But they essentially are usually people that are older than you that you can tell are a bit culturally farther on the path. And there's this way of courting a relationship. And this, to me, it's like, it's so basic and so inherent in traditional culture, but it's pretty actually like out there for most of us that were raised in a modern mass culture, where we also were forced to go to school with people exactly our like age, and this like prison of being, like being competitive and being a prison of peers, is where you are courting a relationship where you are actually creating a some kind of container where you're being like, hey, I see you as a mentor, which means I'm willing to default some sense of power and some sense of holding to you. Not that I'm giving away all of my power to like you to tell me how to like live my life, or that I think that you are like always right. And again, that's a fine line that one develops, but you need to become held by people that can actually hold you, that you trust, can give you feedback and track you and catch your story and really hold you, so you can in some ways be safe enough to let go more and like more. So that's, I say, one of the first steps is really slowly over time courting these people that can hold you. So already there's a cultural context being built for you to step deeper into this journey with.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. I would love to hear, I think, now to even backtrack to your story of finding essentially a cultural context, as well as a orchestrator through your own journey. Like particularly with, again, I know you've done a 4-year cycled wilderness fast journey, and I feel it would be appropriate, I think, to bring that in to show how you came to it, right, as well, and then how did this architecture show up for you?
Thank you. I want to say that how my journey came to be, when I severed, which is essentially meaning that I quit my like stable job, and I said I was essentially going traveling, and I had some like leads, and I wasn't going to stop until this process happened. I'm sure most of you on this call can relate to moments in your life where you felt synchronicity and you felt guided. And for like me, this was a conscious stepping back towards that I'm willing to be guided by synchronicity, by life. And at some level, what unfolded the entire time was there were certain measures of synchronicity. And then as I started to grow and heal and integrate, it just became my own intuitive guidance that led me more and more. Um, and it was about finding a series of containers that essentially could hold me. So certainly one of the biggest containers became I got led to a traditional Lakota, but it's a little bit more complex than even that because the man running it was actually indigenous Peruvian. But I was led to a spiritual community of people that were participating in traditional Lakota ceremony in a very clear, good way, with a very clear lineage from like Lakota medicine people and elders, and all being blessed through the way where I got pulled towards doing a cycle of what in that culture, in the Lakota culture, part of their adulthood initiation rite of passage is people doing 4 years in a row of vision questing, which we often call vision fasting or wilderness vigils, which for me, in my case, in that culture, is 4 days, 4 nights, no food, no water, being completely alone in the wilderness with just 2 blankets. And I want to say that this became definitely a big like bedrock or a big overarching like spine to my own adulthood initiatory rite of passage. And it was not at all enough. That was just some like bones. And a lot had to be woven into that, especially through my own ancestries and reclamating with my own ancestries. So I want to say like this was huge, and I can talk a bit more about what that like was, but also to speak to, I think for everybody seeking to reclamate rites of passage, the only way you can really do that and make it your own and not be just appropriating or borrowing is to have it be somewhat reclamated with you grappling with the loss and then reconnection to your own ancestral lineages, because there is wisdom of this in each of your ancestral cultures. I don't care how white you are, which is commonly, the people that are most disconnected, people that look like me and Ian, but not always. I don't want to make that claim like overall, but that there is ancestral wisdom still in your bones, and that takes its own courtship and its own grief. I also feel the pull towards grief as one of the like streams, but I'm curious, if Ian, you have a sense of where I should take it.
Yeah, I mean, I want to, maybe you could speak too about the specific architecture of a 4-year cycle.
Yeah.
And what is it in that particular cooking pot, right, that is so confronting and so alchemical? I mean, I have my own thread of experience, which, I could share a little bit after perhaps, but I thought for you as well, having gone through it before me, that there was a certain a certain kind of undercurrent of deep wisdom with why it's structured in the way it is, right? As in, because in a way, like that is a bare bones sort of the fast, right? Like no food, no water for a particular period outside. There's something that shows up. That's a pattern that shows up again and again, it seems, in so many cultures. And so why was that, the pattern that continued to show up?
Yeah, I can speak to that. And I want to say again, I found evidence of this in all of my ancestral cultures, and the work I'm currently leading, because I am leading vision fast work, is more and more anchored in that. I'm not leading a Lakota ceremony or anything like that, which has been a big work for like me. So that's why I want to keep naming that, because I actually don't see that happening from a lot of people who are actually leading this kind of work. But this pattern, what like is it, and why is it so important? Well, I really want to speak to, I know a lot of people come to this journey of like cultural transformation through like medicine, like ayahuasca and other things, which is beautiful. And I have a deep path with like psychedelic plant medicines, and it's something I'm currently exploring in a therapeutic context much more. And I want to say that's there's a potentially dangerous pitfall I see of it still being in this adolescent way of like, I'm going to grab at something and take something and consume something in order to be different. And that is the adolescent imprint of like more, take more, consume more, that is fucking up our like planet and our like world at this time. And the incredible thing about this pattern throughout cultures of vision fasting is that it's really going and making yourself an offering. And part of that offering is your willingness to sacrifice food, and in my case, water. It's not always the case. People don't take in water, although I would say it's quite a powerful, it, for me, amplified it tenfold, as you can probably imagine. And it is going to be alone in the wilderness. And part of that, I think, is that at the deepest existential level, as modern human beings, and I think actually as adolescents in general, which is when your ego starts to sense you as a separate self, at age 12, there's this distance between you and this like deepest inherent belonging with life, in the like natural world. And there is something about being alone for 4 days and nights in nature, stuck in one spot where you can't just wander, but you have to essentially confront that aloneness, that I think psychologically does something that's it's beyond just a trick of the mind, where you feel how utterly not alone you are. And I don't actually know a container that can hold that sort of transformation. It's also in many ways a holding a container, and like I could say in like many ways, and this is something I find in traditional cultures again and again, that part of trauma healing in a traditional culture, in cultures that knew, was to create almost a intentional sort of trauma. And I'm not at all saying this is traumatic in the way we think of it, but it is pretty intense. It is a intense experience, and that actually you need that level of, again, not just random intensity, which many of us have had these so-called rough initiations where very intense stuff happened, but it wasn't culturally held and it wasn't intentional, and that is traumatic and not helpful. But to actually bring that energy of that intensity can do something to like help like slough off some of that ego grips that our psyches have. And I can say there is something, maybe psychedelic isn't the best word, but I don't know if a better word now. Like, if part of that container is to come into a psycho-spiritual place of being able to contact the deeper vision, maybe waiting for one's life. What actually a Lakota elder, who is the lineage holder of the tradition I was in, said is a spiritual job description. You need like the level of being altered that happens when you are alone in the wilderness without food and perhaps water is what that actually offers. And for like me, I can personally trust that much more than I can just sitting in per se ayahuasca circle. And again, I'm not trying to rag on that practice. I think it's actually really necessary, but it's not so easy. I think it's easier to go and drink ayahuasca personally. And there's something much different about facing that aloneness and facing that sacrifice, because you're offering something, you're not just taking.
Yeah, thanks, John. I feel to maybe offer my own thread into this moment as well.
Please.
As we are sort of we're arriving at what the experience of being out in this case within this particular context, of which I have experienced as well, and maybe to offer the thread that drew me in. And one of it also was hearing from you, to be honest, that the hearing of your cycle that was ongoing a number of years ago, that certainly drew my curiosity, my sense of why would somebody do this, to themselves, all of these kinds of questions, ego questions, and the rest. And I finally came through. I was part of a community where it actually was born of a deep I'd say a longing,
Mm-hmm.
a deep lament of a mother, actually, of which, in this particular time, John was actually as well. He was present to that. But what had happened within this particular community was that there was a lament that this mother's young son, I believe, who was maybe 14 at the time, uh, she recognized in such a powerful way that she recognized that it was coming. If not, it was already there. Was that she recognized she didn't have what her son needed, her as a mother, like that she could provide so much for him, throughout his
Mm.
stages, but that he was reaching a time now into adolescence, early adolescence, that she recognized her own limitation as a mother, actually, and that there was this plea, actually, is could there something be done? Could there something be done? And I've been hosting this podcast, of course, the Mythic Masculine podcast, the last few years, and it has drawn to me other comments from other mothers
Mm.
too, who've said too, like, what's out there? What can I do for my son? Like, so it is a kind of generally a culture-wide poverty and need, actually, that comes up a lot for young men, especially because there's this somewhat oft phrase, and I know Michael Mead, I think, has used it,
Yes.
but it's this: if the young men aren't initiated, they'll burn down the village to feel the warmth. Which, if you hear that enough, it should chill you, because it's not so much that there's something wrong with young men, it's that they're not being purposely brought to their own sense of purpose and their own sense of responsibility, accountability, and deep need. Like,
Power.
they're not being given, and power, exactly. Like, they're not being sort of led to the recognition of their power and how to be in deep service to life. But the longing is there, actually, which is, again, that's the part that should really stir you, is that young men, I think, deeply long to be drawn up into the big story. I know I did. And so, to come back to that moment, there's this plea that, is there anything can be done? And she was looking to of the men in this case within our community to say, hey, what can you do? And it stirred up a long conversation within a number of the men that had said, okay, we're willing to wonder about this, right? And ultimately, what happened through a series of events that are part of the mystery, is that what was raised was that we, as the older men in this case, couldn't couldn't ask any younger, in this case, any younger man, to do anything that we hadn't done ourselves. Right? That's it. There is that wouldn't be, it wouldn't be appropriate, or wouldn't be in integrity. It wouldn't be, we couldn't rightly say, okay, hold this thing and you go out, when I had never done it either as well. And so that kicked off the necessary recognition that, it was something that these men, that we opted to say yes. And I'll say, absolutely, so much of me said, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this at all. But it followed a similar architecture, just to say that the bones of it were very similar, in that it was a 4-year cycle, 4 days, 3 nights, no food, no water, and very much purposely stripped down, purposely not about questing for a vision, not about any kind of grand heroic anything, but it was, are you willing to make yourself an offering? Which, John, I think you said beautifully there. And
Yes.
I'll say, for my own time out there, that one, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every time is the hardest thing I've ever done, which is surprising. You think, well, you're just sitting out, and how can it be so hard? But it was the hardest, absolutely. And part of that difficulty, of course, was this confrontation, just this ongoing confrontation. You cannot leave, and it's just you, again.
Mm.
And I'll say that, I moved through my days with a sense of just urgency and momentum, perhaps like many of you, that, at the same time, I long for just the moment of those quiet moments of just landing, of saying, okay, everything's enough. And somehow I can't seem to find it in my days. And then during these times, this 4-year cycle, being out there, I'll say all I had was time. And
Yeah.
it was terrifying.
Mm.
That's the part that I recognize. And it was terrifying, because suddenly I had what I, wanted. And the ego, as I recognize it, the ego just went haywire, right? Because it was like, no, I don't want this. I don't want this. And something, again, about that, like, closed loop system provided a kind of short circuiting, which, again, I don't say I've arrived anywhere. I don't say I'm mature or anything. I just say that, but I managed my way through something that at least makes me qualified to just maybe share some of how it was out there, and how I'm tracking again the changes, right? And how perhaps the usefulness may take a long time to show up, again, to say that these things aren't one and done or even four and done, right? But that there's something mysterious that is set in motion, and that's what I want to speak to.
Right. And I mean, there's so much Ian that brings up. I'm just laughing because I'm like, yeah, in some ways, I feel like this rite of passage, what it really grants you is the capacity just to be honest and humble about, like, I'm not really anywhere. And in some ways, that's because this is the reclamation of initiation and rites of passage and village is a generational work. And that for me, when I was 20, 27, 28, once I started this journey, I was like, let's build probably many of us, let's build the village. This is the path. And after many attempts, many with Ian, which were all great learnings, which didn't lead though to the village of our dreams, it really clicked in me that rites of passage, reclamating rites of passage, are the bedrock backbone pathway to reclamating village. Because what Ian's saying, that's a cultural village making moment when a mother is pleading in grief and tears for something to be done for her son that activates the men, that activates the elders. And I've seen that. I just did a consultation for a single mother whose husband had actually passed away about something being done for her son. And of course, it came to a group of men around this family getting together, and all of a sudden it's activating them, and then it's activating elders, and this generational chain, something starts happening, which is building village as a side effect. Because village was never something any indigenous person, I think, set out to go build. It was a side effect of how culture was. And I want to say, starting where we are at, maybe I'll say this last point, Ian, and then pass it back, is that it starts with the grief. This lament that this mother had is the lament we all have at having, when you really face it, at how culture failed us, and it's nobody's fault, and our parents failed us, and it's not their fault, and there's generations of trauma, and it's not our fault, but here we are still perpetrating all the things. It's facing that grief, I'd say, is the first honest step. And they often say that adulthood initiation is crossing the river of grief, and it's crossing that grief of death, really, that everything you love will die, that you will die. Everybody you ever loved is going to leave you. It's touching this grief, and it's that grief, because we don't know how. Even still, with all of our work, and I'd say that this school we're building is a damned good attempt to provide some sense of containership for people to have more support in holding and guidance. And still, we don't know. And still, we are humbly praying in our grief cry to the ancestors, help us. And I want to say, anybody here, there's one thing I can task you with or invite you towards, after this, would be for me to take a bit of ash, which I've been trained in as a very simple, clear offering to the ancestors. Go outside, address your ancestors, even if you never have, and just feel that lack of connection and the not knowing, and be like, ancestors, I don't know how the path forward is, but there needs to be some kind of path. Please help me. And let go of the ash. That for me, that is enough. That step done authentically will lead to all the rest. And that's what's beautiful. And here we are then able to share and exchange, and the journey goes.
Thanks, John. If you tapping it, tapping the well. Yeah, I want to loop back to one key aspect too, which is this confrontation with death again, but also in the context of the wilderness, right? And I've been just really privileged to be around a teacher named Stephen Jenkinson for a number of years now, since 2012. And one of the things he said around, what is the wild in this case? And he says, well, the wild is, it's not you. It's essentially, it's not the human, because the humans make human beings. The wild doesn't make human beings. But there's something about that confrontation that is part of that alchemy, right? And I'll say, the part is being out there within that particular, cooking pot, being outside, is that, at least for me, this attunement, this deep attunement to the slowing down, to the rhythm of the place, is so just stirring, because in my experience as well, starting to recognize just the rhythms that I walk by all the time, right? In this case, I just I'm not even attuned. And I think most modern people, again, like they're moving too fast for the wild to even see them, right? And I'll say that by being attuned in some ways, even just for a moment, right, to this bigger story, alongside this confrontation with death, not saying that it is as spectacular as it might have been if I was 14, right? That there is something lost, like there's something that cannot be
Yes.
recovered, because it didn't happen for me, right, when I was 14, when
Yes.
it may have absolutely seemed like, this may be it, right? Whereas for here, or for the times, when I'm in my late 30s, that it, certainly there's this, wow, this is difficult, and it was still the hardest thing I've ever done. But there's some sense that by being introduced to the bigger story, particularly around that time, one recognizes, like, oh, I'm not the center of the universe, right? But the flip side of that is, but that doesn't mean you're nobody,
Yeah.
right?
And
Like that's the kind of reorientation. It's like, I'm not the center, but I'm not nobody, as in I'm part of this bigger story, and it requires me to, to attune, to orbit a different kind of listening, a different kind of willingness, uh, of
yes.
discipleship, right? Yeah, what does it mean to be generative? Like, these questions now start to emerge differently, because I think that is the deep longing that so many carry, right? Is, how do I actually become generative when all the culture has taught us is to be consumers, and literally refers to us like that, right? And so much of that beginningness, I think, is one's recognition of, yeah, I would say it like this, though: just being able to make contact with the bigger story is a kind of nourishment that, in the Anthropocene, the quality of the Anthropocene is basically, wherever we go, there's more humans, right? And
Yeah.
there's something deeply lonely about that to humans, right? There's
Yeah.
some kind of rising loneliness the more of us there are, as opposed to actually what we do feel is this deep desire to feel connected to the web of life itself.
100%. And something about, I'd say, the most cutting edge for like me of this rites of passage work and this adulthood initiation work. And this has really started to come clear to me in the last 6 months, even. And I've been doing this work for some time. In regards to this wildness, see how okay, it's not about, like, people are often like, I have to reclaim wildness and become like the wildness, and that is still broken, because it's human beings. That's exactly what you're saying. It's all there always was in cultures, the village and a boundary, and then the wild. But there was a relationship and there was point of contact, but it's this sense of boundaries we're often missing, which is actually a lot about the adolescent stage of development. And something I've realized is that in a modern era, what it means to reclaim initiation in a modern era, which was the title of this talk, as part of the adulthood initiation journey for pretty much all of us, we have to stitch up the developmental gaps in childhood and in adolescence. Because all of us, more or less, have certain broken stages in our maybe like baby years. I certainly do. And like middle childhood and adolescent stages. Because if not, what happens, and I also see this happen in village building, it becomes this weird, like, another form of codependent merging. I'm just going to merge with the wild. I'm just going to merge with the village. And it's like, no, there's actually a stage of like, you as a child are dependent. You have to then move into like independence, which is kind of what the adolescent stage is teaching you, how to be independent. And that's great. But then our culture stops there. But most people never truly get independent, because they are still in so many ways dependent, because they didn't go through the full steps. And that's what has to be faced. And then comes interdependence. So I just want to say that there is a lot of work for most people to do around repairing certain senses of like boundary violations, which is where like going to therapy is a part of this greater rite of passage. And that's for me where the highest level can, like, why it has to be beyond, like, you cannot just go do one vision fast, which I want to say I've done 7 now. Like, at least I'm a few is like to really have it kind of take. And then beyond that, there's actually a container which is even greater than that I found that people like need, that I think is then why you court elders and mentors to hold of a greater initiatory journey. And in that, not the most, but a really key part, which we really get stuck, is that the journey ends when you are confirmed and blessed by that cultural context around you. It's not for me to come back from a vision fast and be like, I am now initiated. Again, I can't do that. I cannot confirm that upon myself. I actually need others that I trust that are older and wiser than like me, which, yes, there's a lot of grief here as we live in a poverty of there being a ready amount of those people. But perhaps they get activated by the willingness to ask this of like them. But I need those mentors and elders to in some ways confirm me and say, we see you differently now. You are no longer the John that you like were, and we now hold you to different expectations. And we see you in different ways, and we also see your like gift. And many times maybe it's not about you finding your like vision, but the culture and the elders, when you come back, like seeing it, which they've already seen it because it's born of your like wounds anyways. And so much of this journey, I want to say, is a deep exploration of how you received the exact wounding you need to activate the gift you are meant to give on this planet, which forces you to get out of any like victim consciousness about your wounding. But you can't bypass these like steps again as a hero. So it's quite a complex cultural ask that we are learning to layer here. And it's like, it takes time and it takes increasing levels of that layering for it, I think, to fully happen.
Thanks, Sean. Also appreciating, the comments, that you're making here on the side, at least the side for us. And I want to encourage, we have some time left. And if there are specific questions that are coming to you based on our offerings, then please, share in the comments. We'll look at a way to weave in. By the way, questions tend to be more helpful if they're just concise, because then it's just helpful for us to know if we can hit the mark. As we're waiting for a few more questions to come in, I did want to make a point around, or make a, again, a reapproach to this element of how does village arise, right? Because I think you made a really excellent point, which is that it is like a tangential phenomena, or it's something that arises because you're willing to commit to something else. And the way that something else that I would put forth is essentially the recognition that there's so many ongoing ceremonies that are happening within the procession of both, a human life, as well as the seasonal procession, right? Depending on what time of year it is, what the, plants and animals are doing, what they're requiring. We're stepping into Beltane this weekend as well. And that, the many cultures, of course, my own lineage and Irish and English and Scottish, that they've had these kinds of, and still do, of course, these cultural responses, right, to the rhythms of the earth and what's going on, and how, again, that draws people up into a kind of transpersonal, cavalcade, really cultural cavalcade, right? And I think part of the deep poverties, of course, in so many modern cultures that are disconnected from these, is that, again, we're left to try to craft all of these things ourselves, right? Like it's again, it's on us to do the thing, or to make all of the meaning, or to find ourselves fully, and this and that. And the older intelligence was that this would just be happening because you were committed to these other things. And I think the from births to fatherhood, right, that I've participated now in a few fatherhood rites of passage, again, because recognizing that there's a certain threshold that happens for a man to step truly into fatherhood, and the necessity actually to be held, right, and to be in its own cooking pot again, right, that all of these processions, a walkout ceremony for a young one, of course, wedding seems to be the most possible, recognizable in at least in most modern cultures. I know in Jewish, there's the bar mitzvah, of course, but again, they sort of have their kind of echoes, right, of these deeper rituals that also. Maybe I'll say this though, is that my understanding of what makes a real ritual is that there's a possibility of failure, right? That
Bingo.
there's a possibility that actually it won't. But the reason for that, of course, is because then there's something at stake, right? Rather than just kind of going through the motions of something, because unless there's the willingness to kind of partner with the divine, or I might say partner with the emergent moment, so that the divine can get in the room. Otherwise, you're kind of, again, you're keeping the mystery out and just trying to, keep it on the rails, which is understandable. So again, these are qualities that are sort of required, and the orientation that is required to,
Mm.
and essentially center the reckoning and the tending of these processional moments and all of these rites of passage, versus, of course, in the modern era, so much of it is, earn money, consume, like as in the orbits are completely different. And it's a big reason why I think there's so much disconnection, so much loneliness, and so much desire to actually be part of something bigger.
Yeah. Exactly, Ian. Yeah, I really appreciate naming those pieces because it is. I feel like village and rites of passage are so intertwined, and the longing for one necessitates the other. Um, Also, linking this to some of the questions I see coming up, I want to speak to about ritual intelligence. I want to speak about the for me, what I see is the integration of the masculine and feminine, and I think I can speak well to like that and just how gender enters this conversation. In traditional cultures, often these rites of passage, not in every culture, but were gendered activities. And I think what I've understood is that in many ways, like for me in a male body, the rite of passage, and again, I'm somebody that also is cisgendered that identifies as being male, that the initiatory process is a big journey into the underworld, which is often, this is actually a concept from Carl Jung, as the like anima is actually like integrating my feminine psychological aspect. And in so many ways, to step into adulthood as a male in a more healthy culture is to come into integration and relationship with my feminine so that I'm no longer sourcing that outside, which is what, toxic masculinity does. It both like suppresses this part and shames it and then seeks it outside. And that capacity for this beauty, and really for me, it's like every human being, regardless of, I'd say, their body or expression, maybe it's better to say yin yang, this initiatory moment is that capacity for an integration of this like polarized energies that create a true generative creative power of life. And I want to say we're in a cultural moment of really smashing beyond gender, but it's something both. It's like honoring it and it's also moving beyond it. I think that's a unique cultural moment we are in 2022, that we are all at the cutting edge of exploring.
Mhm.
Per Ian's point, in that, as somebody in a male body, this idea of the ceremony having the possibility to fail, for me, it was important that I was in a certain ritual context where I actually felt like I could die. Not drinking water for 4 days, I had to actually face death. I think, again, there's no blanket statements that can be made here, but I think for people in male bodies, there is a different importance in that, because in traditional cultures, women already have that, or female body people have that in childbirth. The very real possibility of facing death and the wild pain and giving of self in this certain kind of way that male body folks don't have. I want to say I think it's completely essential that people have mentors and elders that are of all genders, and hopefully also in this day and age, some people that are non-gendered or on the spectrum of more than just a single gender. And that it's really learning this diversity, this capacity for diversity. But again, it's a certain capacity that is like, it can name distinctions, but it's still inclusive. And what I've learned personally in this journey, I've come in a lot of contact, I'll also say, with my own queerness and my own sense of femininity, which has allowed actually a certain anchoring for very traditional masculine parts of me to also become more healthily developed. Is my understanding now of my masculinity is that it can include almost everything. And there's then a way where these things start to like blend. So it's quite paradoxical. And you could say, actually, for me, maybe the baseline hallmark of the psychological maturation of a initiated adult is that capacity to hold paradox without it just shattering you. It's that capacity to live in a world of paradox where we are a finite, we are a infinite being in a finite body. That's also at the core of what mystery and like mystery school is, which is part of a framing we're working with in the school.
Thanks, John. I feel, Thomas had left a quote there. Maybe you could speak a little about the possible differences between adolescent rites of passage for men versus women. I mean, you touched on it a little bit there.
What I can say is that there's so much here to unpack. So I want to say this is not linear. This process is non-linear and it's incomplete. And we are all building the full picture. I want to say in traditional cultures, what I understood is that the rite of passage that happened, the adolescent rite of passage from childhood to adolescence, around age 12 and 13, were considered pretty ubiquitously as blood rites. And for female-bodied folks, that happens with the onset of moon time. And there's like a certain cultural response around that. And for men, for male-bodied folks, in these more traditional ancestral cultures, it was often a rite of passage into the empathetic possibility to take life as a hunter and a warrior. Again, to spill blood. But these cultures, they definitely warred and they definitely hunted, but they did it in a way where people could do it with an open heart. Which, again, death is part of life, and we live in a very death-phobic culture. This might trigger some people, but most indigenous peoples also warred, and that to me is not a sign they were necessarily like immature or that's a bigger question. I do hold a vision for a peace culture beyond war, and the older I get and the more I get in touch with boundaries, I'm not saying war is necessary, but boundaries and death are necessary, certainly in like life. And that capacity to know how to set those boundaries and certainly take life in order to eat in a way where you are not psychologically or emotionally shutting down is exactly what that adolescent rite of passage was, especially for male, which again, the idea being that female body folks already have that empathetic capacity because of that difference of like what it is to be in these different biologies. And again, I want to say we're in a big cultural moment of there being a lot of new possibility and exploration around the bigger gender question.
Yeah, thanks for that, John. And some other comments coming in too around women have greater equivalents in many Aboriginal cultures or explicit matriarchs.
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll just say too, John and I are both also sort of steeped in our encounter with a community in Portugal by the name of Tamara, which some of you may know, which, I've come to see as a sort of almost like a Neolithic, reemergence of a kind of older European ancestral villageness. And certainly within that particular culture, absolutely, the women and the matriarchs hold a highly esteemed role. And there's a matriarchal council, and there's this deep sense of that they're holding so much of the wisdom of the land, and of course this question around female elders as well. Sabine Lichtenfels, who's a co-founder of the community as well, for me, absolutely is one of the most, incarnate matriarchal elders, medicine woman that I've ever met, which is profound. And I'll say that whole story as well, to the best of our ability, John and I are actually releasing a film come later this year, finally, after a 7-year saga with the community. But the film will be called, film title might change, but it's currently The Sacred Matrix. So just to plant that seed as well, that there's some sense for us too, that like, that is possible to regenerate a lot of this social field, right? A lot of this within the modern context. John.
And I want to say that the way I really see this right now, and I'm seeing also in this chat, talking about the empty like rituals that accompany generational trauma and just like tradition in general. And I want to say the most mature and accurate way I've seen this is, again, I'm coming from one side of my family being Jewish, and I've seen some people, especially down around a community in California, around a nonprofit called Wilderness Torah. And somebody asked us earlier, like, what about doing this in our existing culture? I think, yes, there has to be a bridge. This is not about burning the culture we have down and building a brand new one from like scratch. That's actually still a very adolescent thing. And we are trapped by tradition in many levels that is outdated, patriarchal, whatever, all the words, colonized. But there's something at this time of a emergence. And I think that Tamara's doing quite well. It's something very old that is also very new. And that's where I think having connection to our own ancestries, but letting it be updated. And I'd say at this moment, having relationship with indigenous folks who can like provide some actual living taproots into the earth. I think is also all like needs to be very rooted into the earth. But there's really this dance of, again, for me, it's also the same like reclamation with our own birth family. Like, I don't think there's any village that will ever really work if the people forming that village of their chosen family have completely broken relationships with your like birth family. And I know there's a lot of need with people for boundaries and maybe even severance with their birth families. And I want to say that it's often in that reclamation where the greatest healing happens. And you have to accept they may never not, we're going to be part of your whatever neo ancestral village, but maybe they could be. And I think it's actually trying to create a space that is more accessible and grounded in like a capacity for the cultural milieu that we are like also in, is part of what keeps this whole process more grounded. This is not us on some far off island trying to do something. It's like we need to be connected to the world that we have. And there's a lot of tools. There's a lot of technologies. For me, it's about integrating the old and the new. So like, that's just a principle I wanted to bring in.
I think this could be a good time too to loop back. Gloria had a good question here too, which here I can bring it up. So might it be possible for initiation to occur within the context of our existing culture without going into the wilderness of the natural world? Yeah, thanks, Gloria. I mean, my take on that is, I think there's something about the one, like a cultural understanding of what initiation is, its function, and why it's necessary, which is helpful, I think, because there's like, imagine you went to, I don't know, your coworkers, right? And you're like, hey, you know what? I'm going through a pretty deep stage of my initiation right now, and I'm going to need a little more time off work, or like, as in, it's so absent, it feels, from so much of the sort of acceptable conversation that there's there's I know fear or ridicule or whatever it is, right? So you kind of have to like really separate them, it seems, within, depending on your job or your family or whatever it is. But if there was a wider understanding of this as like a really helpful and necessary component of one's maturation process, I mean, I think in some ways the gap year, right, from sort of high school into college is, is a little bit understood that way, of like, oh yeah, of course they can go for a walkabout and then come back and then get your job and get down to business. But So during that time, there's a sense of, okay, sure, they can have some exploration time. But I think that beyond that, recognizing that the need for this and the kind of, the cultural recognition of it is really helpful. Now, too, that means that I think it is possible then through the
Yeah.
embedment of one's journey and like in that process of reflection, also courting, the elders and the mentors and things like that. The one doesn't necessarily have to, again, go out to the wilderness, for extended periods of time, necessarily, because this journey of soul initiation can take many forms and it often takes many years. And it kind of has periods of intensity and then periods of just, sort of ebbs and wondering if anything's happening at all. So I don't know if that helps a little bit, Gloria, in the sense of, it's not to fetishize, let's say, a particular need for it to look a certain way. Although, again, that alchemical pattern of that container of being outside in the wild does have a certain ongoing recognition of usefulness, certainly within this process.
Yeah, and I want to say that, I mean, that's an excellent question. And again, it speaks to the paradoxical nature of this. Because in some ways, I think like I'm trying to how to say this in like a humble way, which is always a funny way to start a thing. Um, the idea of like us existing outside of the mass culture we are like in it's not actually possible. Like we are still existing within, like people that think they're outside of capitalism or outside of patriarchy, these things, it's like we're still in it and we're also creating new containers. So it's that capacity to kind of just recognize it's kind of the same way of like whether you recognize your ancestors or like not, you're not outside the stream of ancestors. And it's like up to you then, can you actually acknowledge and build a relationship and acknowledge, you probably got to change some patterns in your like ancestry and form some new imprints, and some new like pathways in the world. And I want to say for me, what it brings up is that there is this thing I understand of becoming a cultural generator, even if you're within an existing healthy culture, where at some point you have to come to the place of like, you've like done the work for like years and you come to the point of like, this is impossible. I must proceed anyways, being of service, even if my own initiation will be forever incomplete. And this is actually, I love something that Sophie Strand says, who's somebody that Ian's interviewed, I've interviewed, she's a friend, where one of her, schemas is make me good soil. And I think that is such a like element of what this initiatory process is. It's like, all right, I might not bloom into the most epic wildflower because I'm too broken, the culture's too broken, whatever. And yet I'm still willing then to be soil for others. And that for me is when initiation truly is taking on a next step, is when you are willing to hold space and be a cultural generator for others around you, older, younger, and like proceeding anyways, even though it is so broken. And I want to say it is impossible. We're faced with an impossible task, and the willingness to go on anyways makes a certain kind of possibility there, if that makes sense what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks, John. I think we're getting closer to the end now in our 90 minutes, which always goes faster than I imagine it will. But if there's any final comments there that come in.
Well, just seeing this last question from John, maybe Ian, can you pull it up, the last comment question? Yeah, any comments or challenges add to all this by being what Jenkinson calls displaced peoples? Example, we're not on any kind of ancestral homeland. Place is a crucial element. What do we do with that? I mean, I want to speak for like me, and part of the work I'm doing is there's like, I don't think it's essential, but there is a series of, for lack of better words, like check boxes that I feel like an initiated adult in this time kind of needs. And I would say, well, one of those is acknowledging you are a displaced people. So I'd say there's like a checkbox of doing a lot of work about becoming a ally to indigenous folks. And I'd say this is even people in like, even if you're not on Turtle Island, figuring that out for your own place. 2, recognizing you are ancestral, you have ancestral roots, and finding some of that connection. And actually, as Stephen Jenkinson says, start to like proceed and dress and speak as if you come from somewhere. And for like me, that involved doing quite a few ancestral pilgrimages to, I know Ian has also done this. And for me, it's like at this point in time, I don't think it has to happen for everybody, but I'd say was a pretty crucial step for like me of this journey of getting to touch those lands that my people came from. And again, you like go there and you also recognize that there was a homeland before that homeland and a homeland before that, all of us going back to Africa, except for maybe people that have been. And again, I think indigenous folks really feel like and claim they come from one place forever. But for people that look like me, that's like, there's been kind of a series. So I also went to like Europe with this, like, I'm going to go to my homeland. And I got there and I was like, oh shit, there was like a lot of movement for a long time. So I want to say though, there's part of like touching that, this the truth of that homelessness and not pretending like it's otherwise, I think can allow us to slowly become, actually, this is something that, I'm forgetting her name, Robin Wall Kimmer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, talks about becoming naturalized. There are certain plants like plantain that are not indigenous to North America, but if they've been here long enough, they become naturalized. So they almost exist as a indigenous native plant would, but they actually have roots. So I think that for me is kind of maybe a better goal. I'm not going to become indigenous or like this being my homeland as if, because you kind of need your ancestors to be buried here for some generations to really have that shift happen. But you can strive to become more naturalized. And I'd say that nature connection and knowing the ecology of the place that you live is fundament to this journey.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Well, I think we're about time now to wind up our conversation here. And I'm feeling grateful myself for our time, for the comments and all of you that have joined us live here for the very first talk of the series of these 5 offerings here as we head into the opening of the School of Mythopoetics. And this was meant to, both be a bit of a sense of the kinds of conversations that we have regularly within the school, as well as the themes that come up, as in this case, a very core theme, actually, of initiation, of rites of passage, because it tends to occupy, in some ways, a gateway, of course, to so many of the other aspects.
Yeah, I think I want to say to that is that the School of Mythopoetics, which we didn't speak right now to Mythopoetics much, but there's a reason we are calling it that is meant to be one part of a container for people to be in their own initiatory process. And we are there to create a cultural web in this amazing way that we have with these technologies that we like have. Again, not that you can do your initiation fully there, but we can provide guidance and containership and part of this like emergent feel where we are being a school, but it's going to be a bit less linear than I'd say the traditional schooling that many of us grew up in. And we want to be co-holding these spaces for each other, to be doing these journeys and coming back and being questioned and mentored and challenged and also caught in our experiences and reflected and witnessed. So I really invite people to check it out, to check out the other events, which are going to be amazing. We're having over this next month, and just to reach out. For me, just keeping this conversation going is so generative and important. And I just am so grateful for everybody for tuning in here and bringing your questions and your curiosity and your body and your heart and your mind.
And to say that this recording is available basically now after this completes. So again, if you want willing to share it, with your networks, share it on your social accounts, to anybody you think would be interested. Tag your friends. That would be super important. It's helpful to us. And one more plug around the events coming up, just because we're so excited, is next week we have the Camel Driver storytelling with Jan Blake, who's incredible. storyteller from Europe. We have From Hero to Trickster, Humanity's Initiation. This will be another talk by John, as well as Benjamin Murphy, who's one of the storytellers within the school. We have The Fall in the Underworld with Dr. Martin Shaw. So definitely don't miss that one. That's the following week. And then finally, Integrating the Shadow, which is essentially offering up an experience of the Way of Counsel, which is a particular ritual container to come together. It'll be held over Zoom, but there's a particular format that encourages deep listening, deep speaking from the heart, and a place to, again, begin to integrate these fragmented parts that perhaps don't have the right containers out there in your world. And last thing is, during this whole phase leading up to the June 1st opening, is that we do have the ability to register. You can enroll at a special founding member rate, which, again, really helps us in the sense of being able for us to really prepare to invest in the school ourselves, all that we've brought to bring in people that can really, offer the gold. And so again, if this feels like you or calling to you, then please check out schoolofmythopoetics.com and enroll, and we'll see you June 1st inside.
Yeah, maybe as a way to close here with this candle, I want to invite everybody just to take a breath, come back into your body. I want to invite you, after we get off this call, to maybe go outside if you have a moment and just put your feet on the earth just to help ground this beautiful energy, which we're talking and we're on computers, and to really bring it into integration. And just as a final closing prayer, something to give gratitude to all those standing behind us, the ancestors of the lands that we are on, the future ones for who we are doing this work for, and for ourselves for showing up, and for this earth that is holding us, and that we are really in this process coming into a relationship to listen to and relate with and be. Once again, so gratitude for all of that and so much, more that wasn't spoken here. Saying thank you and closing this moment of the journey for now.
Beautiful. To be continued.